What's going on, Naperville? It's Friday, November 6th, and this is the Naperville Weekly Market Update. I'm your host, Chris Grano with Keller Williams and the Graham Real Estate Group. Thank you for joining me on the podcast where I answer the number one question that I'm asked every single day, and that's, how is the market? So I hope you guys had a good week. It's definitely been a wild week. We're not going to talk politics, don't worry. And before we dive into the numbers, what I want to do is answer probably the number two question. If number one question I get is how's the market, most likely the number two question I get is when is the right time to buy or when is the right time to sell? And I shot a Facebook Live video about this. You can follow me on Facebook at Chris Grano Realtor. But I just wanted to reiterate here on the podcast that the right time to buy and sell, for the most part, really mostly has to do with you and your family, your job, your life circumstances. You know, salespeople, realtors included, are often trained to, answer that question in a way that, maybe helps them get the sale quicker. But I don't answer the question that way because what's most important is what you have going on in your life. And if you help explain that, if somebody asks me that question, I say, tell me about what you have going on in your life. What are your goals? What are your circumstances? And then we figure out what the best options are. And sometimes the best option might not be to buy right now or sell right now. But since I'm getting it a lot lately, what I can tell you is that right now, as we'll talk about in the podcast, it's an incredible time to buy because of the low interest rates. So you've got that on your side as a buyer. We don't know how long those interest rates will stick around, but they're here now and they're historically low. Then as a seller, we have historically low inventory. So as a seller, it's a great time to buy because you don't have very much competition and prices are in some cases at all-time highs, certainly highs over the last few years. So it can really be a good time either way, but again, it comes down to really what's your life circumstances, what are your finances, and certainly we can dive into that on a more detailed approach. But I just wanted to kind of get that off right here, so that you can hear that and start to think about what that means for your life. All right, so let's dive into this week's numbers for Naperville Real Estate. This week, I think I told you last week that anytime we go into a presidential election, obviously every 4 years, we see a greater dip in activity between October and November. Obviously, the election happening at the beginning of November. We usually see a seasonal slowdown from October to November, about 9.8%. In an election year, that actually increases to about 15%. So we did see a slowdown at the end of the month last month. As a matter of fact, going back 3 weeks, we had new listings of 92, then a decrease to 72, and then 66 last week. Well, this week, attribute whatever you want it to, but we're back up at 98 new listings in Naperville. So a lot of activity in Naperville this week on the housing market. Who knows? Good weather, people wanting to get their homes on the market before the end of the year, before the holidays, but 98 new listings. 57 under contract this week. That number's down just a little bit from last week and down quite a bit from the weeks before. So buyers aren't quite as active this week as they were last week, even though there's more listings. Now, when we look at sold, 92 homes closed in the last week. That's a huge number. It's up 50% over last week. So a lot of properties closed, which means there was a great deal of activity in the preceding month and a half. Now, when I mentioned the interest rates earlier. So if you look at the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage right now, it has dipped down to 2.89. These are new historic lows. So we had historic lows in August, and then we floated back up a little bit towards that 3 mark, and now we're back down at historic lows, 2.89 for the average 30-year fixed rate. The average 15-year fixed rate is 2.39. You can get a 15-year mortgage for under 2.5% interest. It's unreal. If you're not rushing out to get a refinance or maybe refinance from a 30 into a 15, you should be. Let's take a look at the inventory. I mentioned that inventory, again, has been low all year, especially post-COVID. We're looking at right now in single-family homes under $500,000 in Naperville, the lowest inventory we've seen all year. We're looking at 1.74 months supply of inventory, which means that it would take less than 2 months to clear off all the inventory that's currently on the market if nothing new came on. That is an extreme seller's market. It's makes it very competitive for buyers who are out there, and certainly if you see a good property under that $500,000 price point, you are going to be in competition with many other buyers. So make sure that you have your plan in place. Make sure that you know what you have to offer, what leverage you can use to try to get the deal done over those other buyers. Let's take a look, and then to top that off, 53 days on market is the average days on market for a home in that price range. So let's go up to the next price range, $500,000 to $1 million. We're looking at 3.33 months supply of inventory. This is down just a little bit from last week, kind of at the levels that we've seen for the last couple of months. 80 still, in that range, still pretty much a seller's market, and 82 days on market, the average time that it takes to sell a home in that market, in that price range. Now we look at the homes over 1 million. We had, looks like, some closings in the last week in that price range. So our inventory is now down to 8.8. It was hovering at about 14, just about 14 months supply of inventory for the last several weeks. Now down around 8. Obviously, the numbers are going to fluctuate a little bit more drastically in that price range, with, of course, there being less homes for sale in that $1 million plus price range. Still taking about 220 days, so somewhere around 3/4 of a year, 7-8 months to sell a home in that price range. If you have any questions about your particular price range, if you want to know more about what's going on in a specific neighborhood, if you have questions about whether you should be selling this year or next year, again, I led off the podcast to say it really has to do with your life circumstances. However, if you're just interested in purely just the data, what happens if I sell between November and January versus if I sell between February and April, I'd be happy to go over that information with you. You can find me online on social media, Facebook and Instagram at Chris Grano Realtor. You can find this podcast here live on YouTube every week at youtube.com/Chris Grano. And you can find us on great podcast platforms everywhere, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's Naperville Market Update, and I hope you have a great week.